Great. Thank you so much, Sarah. As Sarah mentioned, my name is Leonie Garcia Torres. I'm the Associate Director of State and Local Initiatives at New American Economy, and I am joined by my incredible colleague, Andrew Lim. He is our Director of Quantitative Research at NAE. NAE, we are a bipartisan research and advocacy organization, and we like to make the economic case for sensible and humane immigration reform. We've been extremely fortunate to be able to partner with incredible organizations like IRC and the Refugee Advocacy Lab on everything from removing barriers to professional licenses for refugees and immigrants at the state level to mobilizing businesses to sign on to a refugee pledge that I think you'll get to hear a little bit more about today, making sure that governors are opting into refugee resettlement under the previous administration by showing the economic benefits that our refugee communities bring to us every day, and so many more topics. At NAE, a lot of the work that we do centers around what we're seeing at the federal level, but we also know that all politics are local and that to move the needle, we really need to be taking a look at what's happening in our cities and our states. Even with gridlock in Washington over the past decade, we've seen the state and local leaders leading the way, attracting, entertaining, and integrating new American communities. Since 2014, our state and local team has worked with more than 100 local communities across more than 35 states, and we do so to support policymakers, business leaders, civic leaders who recognize the economic and cultural civic contributions that immigrants and refugees make. So through this work, we've seen firsthand how communities like Utica, New York, or Erie County, Pennsylvania have been revitalized, not just by welcoming, but by integrating refugees. And data is really at the heart of all of our advocacy efforts. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Andrew Lim, to talk a little bit more about that.
Thanks, Leonie. Hi, everyone. I'm Andrew Lim. I'm the Director of Quantitative Research at New American Economy. And, New American Economy has actually been in existence for over a decade now. But really, refugees for us was quite a new area in terms of research until really the past 5 years. And the imperative for that was really because the support for refugee resettlement in the United States was never really in doubt until recently. And it was really traditionally supported because of humanitarian concerns and reasons. And once this began to change in a lot of the public rhetoric, especially under the last administration, alternative forms of justification and arguments in support of refugee resettlement were needed to build consensus around re-upping those numbers. And so to give you an idea of the urgency, which I'm sure you're all well aware of, refugee caps in the past few years were being set lower and lower at their lowest rates. And this was coming at a time when the UN had estimated there were more than 5.9 million refugees, making up more than 70 million displaced people worldwide. And that number is actually from 2020, before COVID, and it might actually be higher. And just to give you an idea in terms of the United States, in terms of refugee arrivals per year, it did fluctuate, but really you're seeing a precipitous drop, really starting in 2016, and that has continued until today, given all that's been going on. Obviously, again, with the previous administration and the ongoing limits to travel due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And so what data is available was really a big question for us, because some of the data, in some senses, refugees are the most documented group of immigrants or foreign-born people in the United States, given all that they have to go through in terms of the various levels of vetting and security clearances in order to even enter the United States. But then at the same time, once they go through the resettlement process, oftentimes they are indistinguishable from other immigrants in US Census Bureau surveys, such as the American Community Survey, the Current Population Survey, or even the 10-year census. And basically in all those surveys, there's no question that specifically asks, how did you enter this country? Did you come as a refugee? And so given that challenge, we were forced to look at a vast range of different data sources from the administrative. So obviously, some of you may be familiar with the data that the US government does release on refugee resettlement, the Yearbook of Immigration Statistics, the RAPS database, other forms of qualitative sources from refugee resettlement agencies, including the IRC. But then really what we ended up basing a lot of our research on was survey data and developing a way of imputing who were likely to be resettled refugees in the United States, regardless of when they had arrived or how far back in the past they had arrived. And so just to give you a very broad overview, refugees in the United States, until 2017, as I mentioned, the United States was really the leading country in terms of third country resettlement in the world. That has changed now in the past few years. But since 1975, when we can really talk about the modern day refugee resettlement program in the United States, more than 3.6 million refugees have been resettled in the US. And again, from that administrative data, we know since 2002, this is what the breakdown of refugees in the United States does look like in terms of countries of origin. So Myanmar at the top of that list, followed by Iraq, Somalia, Bhutan. But really, this is just information that is rather basic. It doesn't tell you anything about the characteristics of refugees. And in order to build a more comprehensive way of telling the story of refugees in the United States, you really need to follow up with their socioeconomic outcomes after they've been resettled and as they gain more experience in the United States. And so, as I mentioned, we did rely on survey data from the US Census Bureau, mainly the American Community Survey, to look at the economic contributions of refugees. And so I sort of mentioned earlier that we use an imputation method to identify cases in each of the surveys where a person was likely to have come into the United States as a resettled refugee. A lot of this is based off of the volume of refugees coming from a specific country that we matched with the RAPS database, as well as their place of birth and the year of entry in the United States. So this is not by no means comprehensive. We know in all likelihood that this is an undercount. So the numbers you see here are actually are very likely to be a very conservative estimate, if you want to say that. But even given that, looking at their socioeconomic characteristics of refugees in the United States, we were able to estimate some really top-line findings in terms of their economic contributions to the United States. So in just 1 year, for example, refugee households earned $99.2 billion in the United States. This allowed them to pay $27.5 billion in taxes, which includes $9.3 billion in state and local taxes and $18.2 billion in federal income taxes. And if you subtract their taxes paid from their income, you kind of arrive at a figure which we like to call their spending power or their consumer power. And this is money that I think is really important to local economies, as this is the money that they have to spend on housing, on consumer goods, and all those kinds of things that is really the money that gets recirculated into local economies. And so after all of that, we found that $71.7 billion in spending power was held by refugee households. And then on top of that, you can also look at their place in the workforce, especially in terms of entrepreneurship. Refugees have a high rate of entrepreneurship in relation to the US average. And in 2019, there were almost 186,000 refugee entrepreneurs. And in total, they earned in business income $5 billion in just 1 year. And continuing sort of that trend, looking over time, we do know as well that refugees, when they first arrive in the United States, are coming often at a very low level in terms of their incomes. And obviously, this has a lot to do with the lack of social capital and the lack of resources that they may have, obviously coming from very conflict-prone or disaster-prone areas. But what we did find is that the longer that refugees had in the United States after their resettlement, you actually saw a very steep upward trajectory in terms of their income levels. And so you see here on the line graph on the right what that looks like for the most recently arrived refugees, as well as for other foreign-born people who did not come as refugees. And similarly, you also see that in terms of their labor force participation and their employment, that refugees also were also more likely to have lower unemployment rates. In 2019, a 96% employment rate. We also took a look at how this compares in terms of their English language acquisition, as well as their rates of naturalization, which we often look as hallmarks of successful integration for all immigrants in the United States. And we also find that in terms of naturalization, that this is really the most concrete step for immigrants or people who are not born US citizens to make in the United States as a sign that they are committed to making their home and their future for them and their families in the US. And so we see here refugees exhibit much higher rates of naturalization than legal immigrants with similar lengths of residency in the United States. Obviously, this might also have to do with the fact that many are unable to return. But also when you look at in terms of English language acquisition, you're seeing here that refugees are more likely to speak English very well or exclusively than other immigrants of similar times of living in the United States. And these are all important because this leads back to their value to their local economies. When the previous administration first put out the policy that states or local jurisdictions could opt out of refugee resettlement, we took a look at what that might look like in terms of costs to the local economies in terms of their states. And so, for example, this table comes from a report that we did in response to that. And so states essentially were risking millions of dollars in income and additional economic stimulus just by opting out of refugee resettlement for 1 year. So we looked at the average rate of refugee resettlement in each state under the previous administration, and which is already lower than in previous years, and looked at what that would look like for 1 year for each state. So you can see here states like California and Texas that are very large states in terms of refugee resettlement are losing out on significant amounts of money, which often speaks more to more moderate and right-leaning local stakeholders. And so with that brief overview, I'll pass it back to Leonie to talk about how we use this data.
Thank you so much, Andrew. So armed with all of this knowledge, how do we move the needle with the policymakers to make sure that they're prioritizing policies that facilitate not just resettlement, but integration efforts? On our team, we like to use this economic research to work with business leaders on the ground, local advocacy groups, and national partners like the IRC in order to help move this conversation forward. We're able to take these tailored economic briefs that show some of these very real impacts that Andrew mentioned and put them in front of the people that are making the decisions so they fully understand. This looks like preparing our partners and local groups on the ground with this research and these beautiful data briefs in order to have member meetings at the federal level and at the state and local level. And we've seen this be very effective, especially as we've been able to help remove barriers for new Americans to have access to professional licenses and have their international credentials recognized. This is so important when folks are coming from countries and depending on the circumstances in which they left, they may not have been able to bring transcripts or bring some of the documentation that they would need in order to be certified here in the US. We're also able to produce research that quantifies the growing need to fully integrate new Americans into the workforce. And we're able to testify at legislative hearings in support, especially during COVID when it was all hands on deck and we really needed as many healthcare professionals as possible. We were able to take the need to remove some of these unnecessary barriers for internationally trained healthcare professionals. And that really opened the door for us. These licensing requirements so burdensome, and what can we be doing in order to make sure that those that want to contribute to our economy have every opportunity to do so. But maybe most importantly, we're able to put this research into the hands of constituents who are able to tell their legislators why these bills are so important to them and their communities. We were very happy to be able to put some of this data into the hands of advocates when to opt into resettlement. And this looks like everything from writing op-eds and letters to the editor to having some closed-door meetings with representatives at the federal level. And then we've also worked with groups, including the IRC, to legislatively establish an Office of New Americans. We've seen these most recently in states like Nevada, Virginia, and very, very recently in Colorado. And these offices really run the gamut depending on what the needs are for each state. But what they do at their core is make sure that integration is at the center of what the state government is doing. This can look like everything from workforce development and creating some career pathway guides for folks to be able to enter into the careers that they were trained in at home, to providing access to adult and language education and naturalization services. And as these offices are established, they become part of a nationwide Office of New Americans network. We're so honored to be able to support this network with data and co-convene it with World Education Services. And just a sneak preview for some of you who are tuning in today, hopefully, fingers crossed, we'll be able to count Oregon as the newest member of this network. They are bringing forward a bill that's in the House, very close to passing, and the sponsor of this is actually Oregon's first ever former refugee state senator. And so we see how facilitating integration doesn't just mean that we're getting tax contributions that help us keep the lights on, or consumer spending that pour money back into our communities, but really help folks who want to make this country home be policymakers as well and help continue this pattern of welcoming and integration. This network that I have been talking about, our Office of New Americans Network, allows us to advise policy staff in the states and offer technical assistance and best practices for meeting the unique and varied needs of immigrant and refugee communities. We know that as an organization based in New York, we don't always understand the context in your state, but you do. And so our goal is to be able to support you with the data to make that case and to fully help everyone who calls your state home. So now we actually want to pass the baton to you. Our data is most powerful when it's in the hands of advocates and constituents. Policymakers at every level of government want to hear directly from you. And so before I turn it back over, I just wanted to leave you with one last resource. This is maptheimpact.org, and Andrew and his team have done an incredible job of making it super easy for you to see the economic impact and the demographics of immigrants and refugees nationally, at the state level, at the county level, at the metro level, and even at the congressional district level. So if you want to dive in a little bit more and see what we have available for you, please feel free to go to maptheimpact.org. Thank you so much, everyone.